Have you ever wondered what your life would be like if you lived at a different time in history? I'm sure all of us have at one point or another, but it can be quite hard to imagine. How would you live as a regular person? What would your house look like? What would your job be? What food would you eat? What would you do for fun? Would you be educated? And would your life be more or less stressful than the one that you lead today? The answer to all these questions can be quite hard to work out. Historians have done much less work researching and reporting on the lives of common people than they have on the lives of a handful of wealthy and powerful individuals. The Wikipedia page for Julius Caesar is 10 times longer than the Wikipedia page for the Roman plebeians. Caesar was a fascinating man, but he did not do as much in his 55 years as 95% of the Roman population did in their combined 1,000 years. The story is much the same for every historic civilizations. Their leaders and ruling classes will be the focus of books, movies, video games, and even scholarly research, while the details on the lives of the majority of the people will be a mere side note. Normally something along the lines of, life sucked, the end. So it's time to learn how history worked, to find out why historians only care about rich and powerful people, when it would be easier and much more relatable to talk about poor people. James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton had something in common beyond just being the anonymous authors who wrote under the name Publius while creating the Federalist Papers. They were, well, if it wasn't obvious, able to read and write. This wasn't a luxury afforded to everyone in early colonial America. An unskilled laborer or an indentured servant could communicate with their fellow humans at the time, but their thoughts and experiences are not shared with us today in writing. This unfortunate circumstance makes it hard for historians to properly document the lives of poor people. In many cases, they'll find one fortunate indentured servant who could write about their experiences, and perhaps they'll share the stories of those who are in the same boat that they are. But for many other cases, unfortunately, they often will use the literate indentured servant's experience to generalize the lives of others. While this approach removes nuance, it's kind of hard to blame the historians. There's not much they have to go off of. A lot of history is lost simply because of exactly this. There is no writing to read into the lives of people who are poor. Even worse, you'll sometimes get a secondhand account of the poor person from the rich literate person. So yeah, how much can we even believe? Even still, lack of first-hand written experiences are just one of the reasons why we tend to only remember the lives of the rich. After all, it was believed that 70% of colonists were literate, so there ought to be some working class people who we should remember, right? Well, yes, and we'll get to that in a second. But as a quick side note on that 70% number, that only includes white Anglo-Saxon colonists. African Americans, Native Americans, and indentured servants were not counted for, and we do not know what the number would be with them. The simple fact of the matter is that written records are one of the easiest and most reliable ways for research historians to piece together how history unfolded. But unfortunately, writing was, up until very recently, a huge luxury. This only gets worse the further you go back in time. Anyways, forgetting about the poor is easy. But surely, as a working class became more literate, historians became better at documenting them, right? Well, no. You see, even once the ability to read and write became commonplace, academics in their ivory towers at the highest institutions of education considered working-class literature as not a fit for academia. Academics' reasoning for this was that they believed that the working-class texts lacked literary merit. One clear example of this is a seminal text titled Life in the Iron Mills, written by Harding Davis, intending to uncover the struggles of the working class in Wheeling, West Virginia in 1861. This writing was incredibly popular when published, but it faded out quickly until the 1960s when another working-class author uncovered it. This piece of writing wasn't embraced by academics and historians because it wasn't considered literature, even though it had the characteristics that met the qualifications. But why? Well, as the saying goes, history is written by the victors, but with a little bit of substituting words, you get this. And while nobody in particular is dying in battle here, the point is that academics were certainly not working class, and would write about people like themselves. Professor Constance Coiner argues this point, that despite economic class now making the list of race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, and disability, it's often the least addressed of these issues in academia. She says that this may be because a few people of working class origin make it into the ranks of the professoriate, so Few people with an insider sensitivity to the issue are undertaking scholarship and shaping curricula. Basically, working class people never had the representation in a historian's library, so a lot of what we know about them has been forgotten. Instead, the people who were in the high thrones of academia didn't read working class literature because it wasn't particularly interesting to them. It's kind of like taking a string quartet and bringing them to a country concert. Like oil and water, they don't mix. This problem wasn't uniquely an American problem either. In the early 1800s, Europe's continuing attempts to colonize made itself the main focus in much of history written during the time and saw themselves as superior. At this point in time, Europe was the star of the show. The region benefited from ongoing scientific progress and at the time, dominated the world in its self-imposed mission to colonize nearly all other continents. Europe was the center of the world for Western historians as Eurocentrism prevailed. Because of this fascination, there was an increased focus on Europe, and not as much on the rest of the world. The practice of viewing and presenting the world from a European, or generally Western perspective, with a belief in glorifying the Western culture, dominated amongst European historians. What was in fact an experience of a select few, usually white European men or nobility of the upper class, was typically presented as the illustrative experience of the entire society. Now, there are two explanations for this. The first is that news and journalism, even in the times of the 1800s, focus on things that people found interesting. Compared to today, journalism was far less competitive. For example, someone in their mid-20s can offer more compelling investigative journalism today than some of the big news organizations. In the 1800s, journalism was more regionalized, and your regular Joe couldn't go out and just casually buy himself a printing press. Because of this, journalism in the past didn't need to be as clickbaity. At the end of the day, everyone needed to be informed, and newspapers were the main source of information. However, they still need to be interesting. Newsworthiness, even in the early times, still included an element of entertainment value. Nobody wants to hear about how your local coffee shop now offers oat milk for their lattes. People want to hear about what's fascinating, what's changing the world. It's why so many kids today are obsessed with Elon Musk. So historians were really only able to document the information that they had, which was often just the newspapers that they were given. They were able to shape narratives in ways that newspapers did. If you were from Europe or the West, the glory of Western ideology and its forced expansion through the world, although they liked to not mention that forced part. The second explanation for all of this is the incentives of the historians themselves. Academia is an interesting environment that has a lot in common with many other places in the world. Historians and academics, much like businessmen, will follow the money. Let's say you wanted to start a museum in London. Great, now you have to come up with a theme. You think of three themes: the mid-1900s American working class literature, early 1800s European colonization, and the American Revolutionary War. Because you run a business, the theme of the American Revolutionary War in a city where the country lost might not sell a lot of tickets, and we might not be able to fill up a room with mid-1900s American working class literature given its little existence. Because the European colonization would probably be the best business decision, you decide to go with that. You then hire a team of historians to conduct research and fill up the museum with artifacts. I think you see where this is going. Money often follows what's interesting. And that's the same for history. The money flows from the pockets of people like you and I to ultimately fund research to give us more interesting museums and articles to read. I hate to say it, but poor people are just not interesting, at least to other people. Who is interesting though? Rich people. Why? Because they're different than us. They don't have the same struggles. They also have the time and resources to go and make history. The historians did get one thing right. Life for most people throughout history mostly sucked. They were more focused on securing their next meal than securing victory in battle, creating beautiful artwork, or documenting the world around them. In some cases though, rich people will even hire their own historians to document their life. John D. Rockefeller hired a family historian, and so did Bill Gates. So rest assured their lives will be well documented. While historians in the year 2500 might add a line for you and I as the generation that got addicted to TikTok. Anyways, if you want to learn about what your life would be like if you grew up in the Weimar Republic, go and check out our video. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.